Hi, I'm Bryce.
And I'm Jimmy.
We are telecom and creative professionals. We're also fans of podcasting as our respective careers give us an abundance of windshield time.
While there is a podcast for just about any obscure topic you can think of, there was no regular podcast pertaining to Montana politics.
And that is why, with our combined powers, we are Montana Voices Podcast.
We strive to be an independent voice for all issues pertaining to Montanans and Montana politics.
We also strive to be very forthcoming with our personal biases as we attempt to see beyond them.
Montana Voices Podcast does not operate in a vacuum. We need your support, whether that be listening to our cast, providing us feedback, sending us conversation topics, sharing our content, or providing financial support.
We look forward to a long career in podcasting with your added assistance.
So, welcome to Montana Voices Podcast. We're in episode 28 of this year, and we have a very special guest with us, Mr. Tim Johnson out of Corvallis, Montana. He's hoping to be our next representative here in Montana. He's got a primary ahead of him. Of course, out of Corvallis, he's currently serving as superintendent for Corvallis Public Schools. He's a father to 6 boys, and he spends a lot of time in the great outdoors. Imagine the 6 boys take you on many adventures. And Bitterroot's a great spot to be an avid outdoorsman. He has some law enforcement experience. Before changing course, realizing that he would rather work with young adults, he spent his formative educational years becoming a law enforcement officer, hoping to be an SRO. Is that right?
SRO or Highway Patrol.
He currently serves as a volunteer reservist for the Valley County Sheriff's Department. So welcome, Mr. Tim Johnson.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, anything you want to correct or add right there to my...
No, I would say that I have a full life.
Absolutely. 6 boys. My goodness, I can't... So we keep on having girls. We're on our 3rd girl and 1 son, our oldest is a boy. So I understand the struggle, and we're hoping for a boy next time, but we'll see if that works out. So
yeah, no, it's fun having 6 boys around. We're a blended family, so I have 2 stepsons and 4 of my own from a previous marriage. So it's when we're all together, it's entertaining.
Absolutely. We're blended as well. So there used to be some stigma with that way back when, but I think the Brady Bunch maybe... took that away.
That may have helped, yep.
Of course, out of Corvallis, first thing on our list is we were talking about the cry of WISPs and rural internet access. That, of course, is a big push for Jon Tester and getting the USDA dollars here in Montana. But, of course, he's not your direct opponent, but certainly on the other side of the aisle. And if you are elected, somebody you'll probably have to work closely with.
That's right. Yeah, and I would, just from a personal experience, I'm not intimately involved or understand all of what's involved with WISPs. My personal experience just with technology access where I live in the Bitterroot Valley, which you'd think, it's a fairly populous area that we would have easy access to the internet. And I actually go off of satellite, and it's limited to a certain amount of downloadable content. And so I'm limited on what I can do at my place. Cell phone coverage is spotty at best as well, and I'm not that far off of US Highway 93 right there in the Corvallis area. So for me, it's a concern, because I think that's something that, as Montanans and as a rural state, the overwhelming majority of the state is rural. How do citizens of the state have access to technology to conduct business?
Absolutely, and that's one of the things they pointed out in the KRTV story before they apparently heard our cries. I'd like to think that there's a news guy over there listening to our cast, hopefully right now. We were talking about WISPs and specifically the small business aspect of it. How when you have my position on the USDA dollars is a lot of these small internet companies don't have somebody that's employed just to look at grant easements and etc. So they're often left in the dust, and what ends up happening is you're paying the large guys to come in to essentially snuff these guys out, or that's what our government dollars are doing as far as making another barrier of entry. So I don't know if that resonates well with you. Of course, are running as a conservative on the Republican ticket. So
correct. Yeah, and I would add to that, just based off of my limited knowledge, that however the infrastructure is put into place, it should be in the sense that it's competitive, allows competition between big and small companies across the board, because it generally allows for better pricing, better services, and as long as the little guy has a shot at it, I think that's important as well.
Right, and that's sort of where the difficulty comes in, where as far as making it so they do have a shot. Yeah. Like I said, they often don't have personnel that are devoted to grant writing or et cetera, as like your CenturyLinks, Verizons, and your other big guys might. So it's only a concern for rural Montana, and I guess there's multiple ways to go about fixing that. I mean, John Tester thinks it's pumping more dollars into the USDA to get these grants for rural development, and a lot of money going that way, because plowing fiber into anywhere is a very expensive venture, and often you're not going to pay for that with customer base, or traditionally you aren't. Or if you let it be the Wild West and let companies such as WISPs or others develop on their own. So, So a quick segue, you are an avid outdoorsman, so
Yes.
hunting season is upon
Hunting
us.
season, I tell you what, it's kind of difficult being indoors today. You're looking at the leaves starting to change here, and the weather's nice. And for me, and I was mentioning this to my wife, it's like, man, my time is now kind of shot with all the campaigning and then the full-time work as a superintendent as well. So I envy those that are out in the woods today and enjoying it. And whether you get something or not, it's always a wonderful experience outside. So
Yeah, absolutely. What do you usually go for?
I'm originally from Minnesota, so whitetail deer hunting was king out there, and so I've enjoyed whitetail hunting or deer hunting for a long time. But I've always had this penchant for hunting elk. I haven't been successful hunting elk.
They're a bit more elusive, so
Yeah, it's an animal that kind of congregates in other areas. It's not widespread, so that's something that you have to spend the time. And as a superintendent, and with some of the duties I have and volunteer work that I do, time is a premium. So I try. I get out there and try. I love grouse hunting. That's another commonality I think between Minnesota and Montana is rough grouse hunting, deer hunting. I also do some predator hunting as well. But it's just the outdoor piece is it's awesome. It's something that I've done with my boys, and my wife. She'll come out and she'll watch. She actually walks and reads a book when I go grouse hunting. She'll just be reading a book while we're walking a logging trail. So that's all good.
Oh, my wife's sort of the opposite. She'll tell me I'm doing it wrong and offer to get in there.
So it's something that my dad shared with me when I was a young boy in east central Minnesota, kind of another rural area, full of mosquitoes and wood ticks and Lyme disease. But it was so fun. We got a bird dog when I was a kid, and I love working with bird dogs because it's this relationship between myself and the dog and the communication and using their skills and talents together it makes it just a joy. I almost enjoy that as much as actually getting a bird and things like that. It's just fun working with a dog too.
It's sort of a year-long project because you're training all year round if you have a bird dog. And
Yeah, it's you're always on top of the training. Yeah, it's you do certain things with the dog year round that reinforce or maintain certain habits that you want to have out in the field, and so you just don't let go of those things, and the obedience and the repetition and the praise. I mean, it works so much better praising a dog and working with a dog that way. It's fun. I love it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we pride ourselves in being a little off the cuff. We had a list of issues going in that I thought would be interesting to discuss, but
Yeah.
going beyond those, I didn't see anything on your website, and this is going to be important for Montana, certainly as our representative, your position on wolves. Because, and also to sort of maybe segue into that a little bit, coming up in a future cast, we are going to have a representative who is takes the hard stance on the position that wolves should be hunted just like any other animals, and he makes a great argument for that. So do you believe they should be protected, or they should be wild or free game, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think we, just as a larger statement, I think we have an obligation to be good stewards of all the resources that are here. They all contribute to a balanced system. At the same time, there's animals that we prefer. Elk. I would love to get an elk. That's something that I would, utilize the meat, year round. So that's something that I look forward to. So I think there's a balance. What I'm getting at is there's a stewardship mindset that we should have around all of these different outdoor resources. So as far as, do I think wolves should be protected or open to management by the states? I think it should be open to the management by the states. I think the states generally know best. And when I say generally, I can't think of a situation where Washington, D.C. knows better than Montanans do when it comes down to the wolf population and how they interact with other animals in our ecosystem here in Montana. So that's where I stand on wolf hunting. I think is a great option. It's managed by FWP. It's something that there's resources that those who hunt, they pay for the tag to go hunt the wolf. There's good management pieces that go into making sure the wolf population doesn't have happen to it what it did, decades ago. So
Absolutely.
yeah. So there's a balance in there. I think as a person who's hunted wolves, I don't want to see them disappear. At the same time, I want to see elk. So I like them both.
And maybe I'm a little, I wouldn't say on the left, but I just can't imagine eating a wolf. It seems too close to dog in my opinion, but to each their own, I guess.
That's true. That is true. Yep.
Moving on to trapping, opinions on that. I'm sort of taking the stance that the proposed ban on trapping, or what some people would like, is just a basically chip on the shoulder, and they're trying to basically segue into more controls on hunters and how available that is in the state for game entirely. So
yeah. I think there's plenty of regulations around trapping and controlling how those that do go out and trap game do that. If they're following the regulations and that trapping the animal is a different way of harvesting an animal. I can appreciate the views that those that don't like trapping have. I really can appreciate it. At the same time, I think it's another way of harvesting that has a long tradition. It's something that has a purpose behind it when it comes down to trapping, and it's not something that I get too wound up over. Other than I think summarily dismissing trapping as a unappealing way of managing another game animal, and these are predators almost exclusively, and
exactly.
So I can appreciate that. I think it's predators are a different type of animal too. I have to say I've hunted both the game and the prey and the predator, I should say, and I actually think it's harder to predator hunt than to hunt the prey or the elk, the deer, those kind of game animals. So it just takes more skill and more patience, and it's just a different kind of approach.
Well, I've never hunted a predator, so I imagine they're a bit smarter than your raptails.
Very wary. Yeah, the Wile E. Coyote phrase is very true. Very wily indeed, and creative.
So you made mention a little bit ago about some roots in Minnesota.
Yeah.
And this is something that we've talked about on the cast before, of how long is long enough to be Montanan per se. You're 18 years into the state, is that right? Or what?
Almost 10. I came out here in 2010.
2010.
And what happened, so I'll give you a little insight into my story. So I was a teacher / administrator in Minnesota, and my job was cut. I had just finished my admin certification, and like I said, living in the West, the Mountain West, outdoors, like that is the crown jewel. And so I started applying for jobs here in Montana, and was hired in a small school district just east of Missoula, Potomac.
Oh.
And I was out there for 4 years, and loved it. Great school district, great community, great experience. We had a lot of success. We did a lot of innovative things out there. And after the 4 years there was a job opening in Corvallis, which I saw from a distance and applied for that too. So yeah, I can totally, I understand, I can appreciate, the perspective around how long have you been in Montana? How well do you understand Montana? I think, frankly, there's a lot of similarities between Minnesota and Montana. There's differences for sure, but there's a lot of similarities. There are times when I hear people say certain words in Montana, it's like, man, that sounds a little Minnesotan,
Like crick.
Crick. Oh, yeah. Crick is a great one. That's like, I know what you mean. Yeah, absolutely. We can go down to the crick. So, yeah, there's some similarities. There's definitely, I can appreciate the differences, though. I think that's something that you respect, and it's not something that you dismiss at all, because I think it's important.
I guess sort of still comes down to the question of how long is long enough to be Montanan? Because I know if Bryce was here, he'd be quick to defend the left. It's sort of our partake there. It feels like they're going to try to give you a black eye for not being, born in a hospital out of Miles City. So, and they try, but of course, the left has their own people that are, I think, Williams was from California, as I believe, but they still try to, Maryland Matt, as they called him in the last
Maryland
election.
Matt, yeah.
Or Danes, of course, but then they, sort of just hush it under the rug when it's somebody like Mayor Wilmot out of Helena who's running again for state office. So I think that's where I got you mixed up with the 18 years I was thinking of.
Yeah.
Will Mountain Howell, I don't think anybody on the right would, dare question his Montanan roots. I mean, looking into some of his history, sometimes I feel like he's more American and Montanan than I am, having served and such. But
Yeah.
but I think a long time, and not to say that just because you're not, born, like I said, out of a barn in Potomac or wherever, that you're not Montana and not qualified. So sort of, I think, unfair to sling mud that way, in my opinion.
Well, I think it's a good start to the conversation, but if that's the sum total of the conversation, then I think you shortchange the possibilities of doing things differently. Or I can understand both perspectives. I think I'm passionate. So I guess this is going to be public, so I get it out there. But in Minnesota, there's a kind of a phrase or an understanding that it's Minnesota nice. And when I came out here to visit in 2009, and it was a short visit, and I went back to Minnesota, Montana, it's nicer than Minnesota. And I truly believe that when it comes down to just the people that I've met and I've worked with, and that's ever since I've came out here permanently in 2010. There is nothing like Montanans. I go back to Minnesota to visit family and things like that, and it's a great place to be. But that's just how much better I think Montana is to everybody. I mean, the way that Montanans treat each other and treat people who are here visiting or whatever, it's memorable. It leaves an impact.
I'm going to agree with you wholeheartedly. Montana's the best state of the union, so
Yeah.
can say that on Montana Voices podcast.
Yeah.
Moving on to some of our, I guess we'll call them canned responses. Was there any specific event that sort of led you to making this your first attempt at, being a representative?
So I'm 23 years in public education, and public education is viewed, I think, and this is a generalization, whether it's fair or not. This is just, I think, something that most people would agree that tends to have a more liberal support base to it. The NEA, the Democratic support, public education, and right or wrong, that's kind of how it goes. This is something that I've chosen to be involved in as a conservative. Because I care deeply about educating our youth, deeply. That's one of the reasons why I stepped out of law enforcement my first time around and got into education, because I want to work with youth. And so that's something that over time I've found that some of the conservative things that I try to work with in public education, it's a real struggle. And it's a real struggle, I think, to maintain balance. I think it tends to get out of balance at times. I think we're in a situation now where we're out of balance, but it's never something that goes just out of whack. Public education is not broken. Public education has, much like a pendulum, it goes back and forth because it is such a public interest in this country, in this state,
Absolutely.
in every locality.
So maybe moving on to more federal things.
Sure.
Going through some of your bullet points on your website. You mentioned sort of, I guess, dives into school choice, charter schools, and that's been a real hot topic for, at least on the federal level. I don't think I've seen too much commotion in Montana as far as, I guess, the voucher system or proposed voucher system of having, basically, for our listeners that don't know, you would, instead of, you get a tax credit or some sort of voucher where if you choose to send your kids to private school, that you're not basically publicly funding their school.
Correct.
Is that a good statement there? Or?
Well, let me sum it up this way. I think the voucher system is a Trojan horse. According to the Montana Constitution, this is a state issue to start with. According to the Montana Constitution, that public funds are not to be distributed to private institutions that have a religious bend to them. The voucher system, to me, in conjunction with the Constitution, is one way where public funds, whether they're gathered up or they're pre-tax and you can utilize them on your own, is one way for, I think, federal or state oversight. And I think that's not a good idea for the folks that want to use that system. I think the whole point of the voucher system is to have more independent control and have choice. But wherever the money goes, there's always a string attached to it. And that's where I hear conservatives talk to me about this on this issue, and I tell them I warn against it. I say, this is, in the long run, this is not going to work the way that you think it is. I mean, you look at the public education system. Over time, there have been more strings attached with every dollar that we get from whatever the source happens to be. And it never results in what you thought it was at the beginning. So I really caution against the voucher system because I think it's a Trojan horse. The choice piece, I'm a firm believer in the choice part of it. I think choice has really helped education in the long run. It's helped push school districts to work to better their craft, to better their capacity to meet the needs of students, so long as there's a legitimate choice, that people have, not a straw man kind of a choice. So I think choice has been beneficial. I think for the years when I was in school, choice was not an option, if I remember right. And I wasn't paying attention to politics when I was in kindergarten and first grade. But, you went to the neighborhood school, that's what you had, and that's, it was kind of a very internal control kind of a thing. But when you start competing with other schools and other districts, then things, I think they've gotten better overall. And there's some pieces to choice that can be detracting or maybe go the other direction. But overall, I think school choice has benefited schools.
I'm going to agree with you there as well. So unfortunately, Bryce isn't here to argue with me, so it feels like I have to try to do that with myself.
Yeah.
And of course, chime back to when you went back to school, because that was before we had I guess, as the federal overreach, the sort of hands of sort of control over all the smaller schools. And going back to even my grandparents' generation, where it was a one-room schoolhouse, but that was locally controlled with some state and some federal dollars, but there wasn't that, I guess, oversight that you have now. And what is the test? No Child Left Behind is
right.
What comes immediately into mind as far as, federal government having their claws in each school district.
Right,
so.
Right. And that to me, there's a point at which, the Department of Education was formed around the enforcement of civil rights laws. And that's where the Department of Education came into being, was to fulfill that obligation in the public school system. And I think we've done a good job. It's not perfect. I think we've done a good job in fulfilling, Brown versus Board of Education 1 and 2. We can do better. We can, I think there's some things that need to be tweaked, but I think overall, I think we've done a good job. The issue that I have really with the federal Department of Education is that input into public schools in Montana has grown. And I've said this in board meetings and around wherever I'm asked this question. If I could give the federal money back to the federal government, I would, because the ping pong effect that we get every 4 years if a new president is elected is ridiculous as far as how we're treated as a public institution when it comes to federal dollars. In addition, these unfunded mandates. There's, when it comes down to special education, title education, we lose in Corvallis, we lose $15,000 every year. And yet we're still obligated to provide those same services at the same level. So what happens then is Montanans pay the taxes basically to backfill what the federal government has pulled out. So not only are they pulling the strings on us financially, they're not paying us what we're supposed to get when it came to that mandated program in the first place. So it is, to me, there needs to be some serious looks at what the role of the federal government in public education is. I would prefer to roll that responsibilities more back into the states for now. That's just my perspective on the role of federal government. Now, does that mean that there is no role for the federal government in education? Clearly, that's not the case. Brown versus the Board of Education shows that. Mm-hmm. So there is a role, but I think it needs to be looked at with a fine-tooth comb.
You think that's still an issue today? I mean, you pointed out the Brown versus Board of Education. So say that went the other way, or we no longer had that overreach, the decision was reversed. Do you think that would have negative repercussions, or do you think...
If Brown was overturned or did not exist?
Did not exist. Well, at the time, I will agree with you 100%. It was needed and important. But in 2019, is it as relevant, basically?
No, I don't think it's as relevant in the way that they're executing the Department of Education initiatives, along with the Office of Civil Rights. There are other avenues that these things can be affected, and to have a whole department in the federal government dedicated to this, I think it's not a effective or efficient use of resources. And so it's kind of a hard question to answer. What would it be like if we didn't have Brown versus Board of Education, or if we didn't have the OCR, Office of Civil Rights, mm-hmm. Which is kind of the enforcement division of the Department of Education. It's difficult to say what that would be. I just think it's at this point in time in education, we have you take, let's take school choice again. School choice compels us to do things differently, because what happens is families get to choose where their dollars go by where their child enrolls in public schools. So we're compelled financially to meet the needs of students the best that we can. We don't need the Department of Education to tell us this stuff. We've got families telling us in a much closer relationship than the federal government when it comes down to it. So that's, I think, an example of how some of those things can be addressed.
So I've burned up a fair amount of time. Imagine you could talk all evening regarding education.
Sure, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah.
Something that's close and dear to your heart. Main questions that we want to address, and these were written by our executive script guy. He's has a political science degree and is smarter than all of us, but they they kind of feel like canned questions, like it's the same thing you'd get if CNN was sitting here with you. What sets you apart from other candidates in this very race who have won Montana elections? This, of course, is your first run for this. For example, we have Rosendale and Stapleton, who are both running, and they've won state-level positions. How are you planning to combat that? Because obviously not only name recognition, but people have voted for him in the past.
I will say Tim Johnson's a very common name in the phone book, though. So name recognition is a matter of perspective. But so how do I set myself apart? How do my experiences apply? The concern that I have and why I got into this race is the silo effect when it comes down to debating issues. We debate, or we talk about, or we get impassioned over issues in silos in this conversation around a particular specific topic. And we're not bringing in the other layers that are also involved in this conversation, not to mention the overarching role of the federal government when it comes down to having a role in the first place. And by focusing on just real specific issue by issue, I think we lose track of where all of these things are supposed to be in the first place. That's a concern I have. And it's not just Republicans, it's politics in general, that we have gotten very minutia focused around issues, and we're losing some of the bigger picture pieces. And that's what my focus has been in education, because education is a microcosm of the federal government. I mean,
exactly.
We get all of the initiatives coming our direction when it comes to financials, when it comes to social issues, all that stuff. And so it's important. It's really important to ground yourself in the larger picture. And I think that's what my experience in education has forced me to do, because to run a school system, you have to be aware of all that. And so that's I think my experiences are, for 23 years as a full-time educator, I think that's an important piece.
And maybe this ties into my next question. You pointed out those, single voting issues, and one of them, of course, is abortion, which you propose there should be an amendment to the Constitution that says life begins at conception. Is that right?
Yeah.
And that is one of those issues that people will, vote one way or the other on, but that is the only issue that a lot of people will vote on. How do you plan to overcome that? Say there's a conservative who believes in their pro-choice, or how do you plan to overcome that while being, I guess, modern enough to capture those voters?
Well, I think, to me, this is an important issue around the definition of human life. And with the definition of human, so this goes back to that bigger picture. When we define what human life is, then the rights and the privileges go along with it. So that definition is really important. If we talk about just a specific component of it, we lose track of the larger picture of what is human life. In public education, you come back, this is public education through and through. We teach, when it comes to, let's say, astronomy, and this is something that I, as an educator, presented to the state legislature on the personhood bill. We teach, if we were to send a rocket ship up to Mars and we were looking for life, what does it take to say life exists on Mars?
Right, it's
one cell. All we need is one cell that is unique and different from the surrounding environment, and we've established life on a planet. We don't have the same perspective when it comes to human life, and I think that's contradictory, and I think it's confusing, starting with public education. That's a real problem, and so this confusion then around a logical or even a scientific definition of when life begins and the stages of life that result from that translate into these larger social questions. But we focused in on the social questions first, and we haven't gone back and resolved the very first question of what does it take to make life? We have to answer that question first.
We have a single seat in Congress, and how do you plan on making our voices heard?
This goes back to experiences in public education. This is part of making public education relevant to the residents within a school district. This is, as a superintendent, this is your school district. This is your representative seat in Congress. And the way that I view this, and the frustration that I have, is when it comes down to either Senate seats or the House seats, you typically start hearing from those members of Congress the year before they come back and they start having town hall meetings. And I can appreciate that there's a lot of work to be done, but somehow they manage to have those town hall meetings at a certain time prior to an election cycle. So my perspective is that shouldn't be something that we just cram for the test, a certain period of time before an election. That this should be a constant relationship. You should be meeting and talking with folks, letting them know what's going on with Washington. My perspective is you're bringing Washington back to Montana so we understand what's going on. Mm-hmm. And my role as a representative would be to influence Washington as a Montanan.
Well, on your site, you pledged to visit every single county in Montana.
All 56, yeah.
All 56. So how do you plan to balance the needs of the most rural parts of Montana? Obviously, Ravalli is pretty populous, but it has I think a different point of view that a Missoula might take, or Missoula County might take. How do you plan to balance between those two, rural and urban worldviews?
Well, you're elected as a representative, and so you certainly take the input from all of the constituents in the state of Montana, but you're also elected as a person with stated intentions, and so there's influences involved, but this isn't something that is just totally fluid and dynamic that I'm gonna do whatever the voters tell me to do. It's a representative process, and so I represent based off of the votes, based off of the stated intentions. So, but I think it's also very important that, and I think this is largely missed in politics, and that is that we have much more in common than we have in differences generally. Now, there's going to be some significant differences, and those differences will be differences. That's the way it works. I think to hear what those commonalities are and to make sure that we don't skip over those things and focus in on the differences with all our energy and all of our passion and resources. Like that to me is a misuse of the conversations that we can have as Montanans. And that's, again, in public education, there's all kinds of views in public education and who should be doing what and why and all that. And I go back to, so what do we have in common? Let's build off of that first. We'll probably take care of most of what the concerns are, maybe in a different way, but we can do most of it. And then at the end of the day, if we have differences, we have differences. And that's where we're at.
So take Missoula County, for example. Obviously a very populous county, Yellowstone. Yes. I think Yellowstone, Great Falls are a little bit more on the right than Missoula County. And Missoula, I think, is larger than the surrounding 5 counties, if I'm thinking right. Mm-hmm. So, it's sort of a chicken and an egg as far as being representative and most liked amongst your constituents of trying to balance, Missoula with everybody else. So
I understand the question then. Missoula may be different perspective in worldviews and perspectives around different issues than maybe the larger or the other part of the populations that have elected a representative. And how do you work with those differences?
Right. Say Missoula and the majority of voters are going to say, hypothetically, not to say this is the case, are going to disagree with you on the subject of being pro-life and mm-hmm. defining life right at conception. Mm-hmm. And or would assume that you would not get elected if you run on that platform. Mm-hmm. Is that going to make a difference for you?
Well, that's where if it's a value that you hold dearly, then it's a value you hold dearly, and the consequences go along with it. Mm-hmm. And I'm willing to do that. I think that's something that is important enough to me to take that stand. At the same time, I think there's another piece to this. If I can kind of do a little tangent off of this,
please do.
That is when we have when we have a debate around these types of issues, like pro-choice versus pro-life, guns, Second Amendment, banning this or not banning that. The debates or the conversations are more about posturing and more about fist pounding on particular issues rather than actually debating and getting into what the rationale is behind these things, and actually getting into a more informative conversation around these things. And maybe that's a utopian perspective that I have, but that's the disconnect when it comes down to, whether or not I get elected based off of this issue. I ask the question, do we really understand what these issues mean in the context of a debate? So have we actually gone out and fleshed all this out, and what the pieces are that, again, larger picture, bringing in, this is layers of an onion, putting the whole onion in front of you and saying, let's deal with all these different pieces. Because I'll tell you, here's an example on the pro-life piece and the pro-choice versus pro-life in public education that we don't talk about. And this is a major issue in public education that just gets pushed under the carpet, and which is what I was trying to present at the personhood bill hearing. And that is, not only do we have the classroom conversation around what constitutes life. This part I didn't talk about, but I didn't have time to. When we have a teenager who comes into our office, into a counselor's office, who's pregnant, and we know that teenager is using drugs or alcohol, we're mandated reporters by statute. And according to the statute says that you'll report child abuse. So the real question is that teenager pregnant with a child or pregnant with a choice? I'm kind of characterizing it here, but you get the idea. Because we're mandated reporters by state statute. We're criminally liable if we don't report it. And we know this teenager is using drugs or alcohol. So what do we do? This question is very important. And to posture around the idea of, kind of typical political, bumper stickers around this topic doesn't get at answering some of these important questions. It doesn't get at, these are some serious pieces that should be informing the debate, not just on the fringes. So that's what I would, when it comes down to it, I'm willing to have the conversation. So long as we can have the conversation, let's have the whole conversation and not have a bumper sticker exchange in the process. And again, I'm willing to disagree on ideas, but I absolutely will not give up on people. Absolutely will not do that.
Well, I appreciate that, because that's one of the main reasons we started this production, is get so bunkered down, and people that I otherwise normally like and are good friends with, and we just get split on some issues, and arguing back and forth specifically on social media is doing a whole lot of people a disservice, I think. So we wanted something a bit more nuanced, where we found, between far right and far left, that we're people and we're more common and agree on more things than I think some people would like us to believe. So
isn't it interesting that we are, I believe, more disconnected relationally, even though we're more connected technologically? I think there's a growing misunderstanding of people because of social media, the platform of social media, the way that it operates, that I think we're less connected than we've ever been before in a lot of ways. Even though we're talking to each other, it's not really like you and I sitting here, talking face to face. There's more to it than chatting on.
I think a lot of it is by design. But of course, take Facebook, for example, where we will be streaming live as well as other platforms. It polarizes you. Facebook, first of all, categorizes you as far left, liberal, conservative, far right. It puts a tag on that. And I've found, as I'm voicing more opinions on Facebook, where previously I try to avoid that other than this very cast, that I was guaranteed to see something on my feed posted by somebody I normally like that I just thought was appalling and just politically disastrous, basically. Mm-hmm. So I was more likely to see that after posting on there. So I think it's by design, because Facebook has an algorithm. They know how to keep you on Facebook, and as well as other social media platforms. So taking time to sit down. I really appreciate this, Tim Johnson. It's Tim Johnson running on the Republican ticket, hoping to be our next representative for the state of Montana. Mm-hmm. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. It's been good.